Want to welcome all of you to CCC exposures featuring Ken Baldwin. It is nice to be able to introduce him more simplistically as Vice President of Marine of LIG Marine Managers. Ken's been doing speaking for us for quite some time, and now it's nice to be able to say this is it's just nice to introduce him as one of our own.
Thank you, Mark.
This is the first of two parts about Marine CCC exposures. The next one is in 2 weeks, and we'll round out the rest of what we don't cover today. You can go on and register for that and all of our upcoming webinars at ligmarine.com/webinar. And that should give you all the previous recordings. This one will be recorded and posted as soon as we have the recording processed, and the next one will be up for future things. Keep an eye out for new ones. We're adding them all the time. We're trying to do these every 2 weeks or so that hopefully everybody has something interesting every so often. At the end of this webinar, we will have time for questions. Please ask them in the chat box in the GoToMeeting system. We were happy to go through those, and we'll help. We'll answer all of those we can during the time. And if we don't get to it, we will say we'll get to it next time. So as you come up with the questions, please throw them into the question box in the GoToWebinar interface, and hopefully we'll get it. Without further ado, I'm going to start it off with Ken Baldwin. Ken, you say hello to everybody.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate all the nice things you said, and welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Mark? Mark, can you hear me? Mark, are you there? Mark, can you hear me?
I hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining me. I'm sorry if this is my first time doing this on this computer, so I apologize if this is a little crazy. Yes, I have started here 4 months ago. Very glad to be at LIG. A lot of great people around us. You know, by the way, though, this is my 36th year in the marine insurance business. So if you guys have any questions, email me, you know, at my LIG website. I'll be happy to help you out, happy to answer. So on the next slide, turn the slide, please, Mark.
Perfect.
So these are the two courses that we will have. It's care, custody, control, liabilities. It'll be in 2 sessions. The first will be today, which will be covering ship repairing legal liability and wharfinger's legal liability. And I'll explain exactly what both of those two mean. And in the second session, we'll be doing landing owner's legal liability, landing dock bailey legal liability, which is very close to that first one, but somewhat a little bit different. Terminal operator's legal liability, which is somebody who's, you know, unloading a ship and has the whole thing going on. And then stevedore's legal liability, which is somebody who does unload the ship only. We'll be going through those and trying to get everybody all of the ideas and what these things can be done and how to accomplish covering all these different exposures. So I know that one of the things that LIG really wants to do is educate people on ocean marine exposures and coverages, and that's why we do these things. So today we're going to be doing just the ship repairs and the wharfinger's legal liability on a standalone basis. You can get these different coverages with MGL attached to it, and that would cover, you know, the bodily injury portions. The ship repairs and the wharfinger's legal are just things that the operator has care, custody, and control of, which is very in-depth and very kind of complex. So that's why we're doing it separately versus just looking at the MGL. The second one, the landing owners, landing dock, terminals, and stevedores, will be on the 16th of September. So if you guys would like to join that, just please sign up for it, and we'll be happy to go through all those different coverages also. Next slide, please. So care, custody, control, liability. So what does that mean? I mean, when do you even need it? It's really, really a broad thing. I always joke and say, if I tell someone here, hold my camera, and they damage it, that was actually something they needed care, custody, and control liability for. It's anything that you get from somebody else, they need coverage for. In the marine business, it's more when you're moving cargo and handling it for people and storing it for people. So what the coverage is, that's the coverage we're going to go through. We're going to go through some standard wording. We're going to use the AIMU form, which is an industry standard, but the way marine insurance is done is that everyone has their own little policies. So I always encourage people to, if you're binding a policy, look and ask for the actual wording from the company, because they can be slightly different. And the last thing anybody wants to do is to have an E&O and have something not covered that they thought was covered. So different companies have very different coverages. Some have the major exclusions. Almost everyone has a war and strikes, riots exclusion, but other companies have different exclusions. So today we're just going to go through the AIMU one, which is the most used one going. And then we're going to go over when you use the different forms and how to use them and how they fit into things. Okay. Next page, Mark. So ship repairs, legal liability. I tried to get an even better picture of ship repairs, but I couldn't. But even a ship that is standing and getting containers off and on board could be actually under ship repairs, legal liability, needing ship repairs, legal liability coverage for people, because they may be working at something really small. They may be working on some interior designs or something like that. So even if they're just sitting at the dock and containers are being loaded, it still may have someone that is working on the ship, and that person needs ship repairs, legal liability. So this picture actually is something that someone may actually be needing the coverage and working on a ship. But we're going to go through what the coverages mean on ship repairs, legal liability in the next page. Next page, Mark, please. Okay. So this is the main coverage, and it's also, again, the AIMU form. This company agrees to pay on behalf of the insured all sums as a ship repairer shall become legally obligated to pay by reasons of liabilities imposed upon the insured by law for physical loss or damage to the watercraft and their equipment, cargo, and other interests on board occurring only while such watercraft are in the care, custody, or control of the insured for the purposes of repair or alteration at, and there's a blank space, which I'll go through how people want to deal with that, because you have different options to put in there and different ways an underwriter will address it. All while such watercraft are being moved via inland waters for a distance not exceeding X number of miles in connections with the repair or alterations. So, the first thing I will say is the one really great thing about this policy is if you look, it says pay on behalf of. A lot of ship repairs legal liability is for different, if you have a company that's putting it on out, it doesn't say pay on behalf of, they say reimburse. And the pay on behalf of is much better because that means the insurance company is actually going to pay for you versus you have to pay and then the reinsurance company reimburses you. If the claim is very large, it's very difficult to have your insured pay it. So pay on behalf of is something that you really want to see on a policy. Then the next thing too I'll point out is it says imposed upon the insured by law for physical loss or damage. What that kind of means is that it's not just contractual liability. The contractual liability, if someone agrees to say something like, hey, if you damage my vessel, you're going to be paying me $500,000. Well, that's not what this is covering. This is covering the actual, liability for the damage, not necessarily any written contracts that agree to do certain things. The other nice thing about this policy, if you look, it says it's not just the watercraft that is covered. It's the equipment, the cargo on board. So if somebody's repairing, let's say, a crane on the vessel, and they actually end up causing a little bit of a fire and damaging the cargo on board, that's covered by this ship repairers thing too, even though it has nothing to do with the ship, it's the cargo on board. And any other interests, I mean, that's very, very broad. So seaman has, clothing on board and it's damaged by the ship repairer, it's covered if it was the ship repairer's liability, if he did something wrong. And it says, that we will cover these things, anytime that they're working. And it's also non-vessel items. It's good for a mobile repair company. It doesn't have to be somebody who's got a place that all the ships are repaired at. It might be a mobile repair person that needs this coverage. He goes to various ships and works on the engine while the ship is on someone else's dock, is unloading. You'd still need ship repairers legal liability. It would just be, you'd have to make sure that the spot where it says repair or alteration says at anywhere in the United States or something such broad language like that. If you have, a specific location where you're repairing it, it's good to put the location in there too. And this also covers, the watercraft while it's being moved. So a lot of times what happens is that the watercraft is being repaired, and then after the repair is done, they want to test it. Kind of like, when you want to go your car, you have something wrong with your car, the brakes are bad, and you go and drive it around a little bit to make sure that the guy who fixed it, made it right. Well, the same thing happens here. I've been on ships where, you take the watercraft out for, 10, 15 minutes and, make sure that the engine's running properly after it's been in the shipyard. That just happens. And, one of the things I will point out that I will, warn everybody is the one thing I don't like, and it's less broad, is it says inland waters. A lot of times you have to be really careful of that. I like just saying any waters, because if your shipyard is right next to the bay and it goes out into the ocean for, a very short distance for a run, if it says inland waters there, if that's left in there, then it may not be covered because that's not inland waters. So, if it just says X number of miles, that's fine. But inland waters, you really have to be careful of that. They're just sea trials. That's what ends up happening. So, I sometimes take that inland waters out. But this is good coverage, good broad coverage. Next slide, Mark, please. And then, there's other things too that happens. You're testing the watercraft and you've been repairing it. And let's say you worked on the steering column and whoever did it wrong, and you're out there navigating, just to make sure things are correct. And instead of it working correctly, it just happens to break again and you hit something, you hit another vessel. Well, the ship repairer's legal liability covers the property damage caused by that watercraft while it's in your care, custody, control, being navigated away from the premises that you have listed. It's within the permitted waters, provided that an employee or an employee of the insured is operating the vessel. Anything that happens while they're operating it, the property damage is covered. So this is a really important thing. A lot of people don't realize this, but this happens a lot. Somebody may actually get into an accident or something may go wrong or the repair may not have done exactly right and something happens. Well, this is an important thing to have in there. Now, and if it's in tow of a tug not owned by you or chartered to you, it's also covered if you damage anything. So for instance, you've hired a tow to get the vessel into the dockyard, and the tug that is rented, or you hired, damages something. Well, they do have liability, but you're going to get sued too. So this is also something where it's covering you for the damage to the vessels or any of the damage to property damage that vessel might do. There is a condition I will point out that makes things a little bit more difficult for an insured. It says on the bottom of this, as part of the clause, it says, is a condition of this clause that the employees engaged in the navigation of the watercraft shall possess such license as required by the United States Coast Guard. That's pretty normal. A Coast Guard, anything in the U.S. that's being operated, somebody who needs a license should have it. But then the other part says any other applicable regulatory authority to perform the duties carried out by said employee. Well, there are very many different little local laws for who can operate a vessel. So you may have, somebody that's, and this is not just for large vessels. So you have somebody who's repairing, let's say, a 20-foot, a little tiny boat, a motorboat, and the person who is repairing it doesn't have the proper license or the proper local license, and they get into an accident and cause property damage to other things. That's actually excluded by this. So just watch out for that. Make sure that if you have these coverages in there, that your insureds have all the proper regulatory filings and things, that this would cover it all then. So next slide, please, Mark. And this is another nice thing too that's in this thing. It covers the cost of defending any suit against the insured on any claim based on liability or even the alleged liability of the insured covered by this insurance, provided the amount of the claim exceeds the amount of deductible under the policy. So this is if it's, $1,000 thing, and the policy's got a $5,000 deductible, the insurance company is not going to care about, what goes on. They're going to say, hey, Mr. Insured, you have to settle out by yourself. But if this is a large claim, lots of times I've seen claims where the insured did nothing wrong and somebody's suing them just to try to get some money out of them. And this is a nice thing where then the insurance company steps in and says, we're going to take all of the legal law firms, expenses and come to bat for you and try to make sure that we make, that we win the case for you. And that, we're going to defend you. And we're going to, kind of really make sure that if you're liable for it, then too, that you're not liable for more than, you should be liable for. There are cases where the company comes and offers money, and the allegations are such that the amount of money is much more than what the ship repairers should be paying. And they go in there and they actually fight it and get it much, much reduced, which is the good thing. One of the things to watch out for, though, is that you have to have the insurance company give written consent saying, yes, we're going to cover you before all of the costs are burdened, to the insurance company. And so you should warn your insureds that, if they're, going back and forth on a claim, to make sure to report it to the insurance company and get them involved fairly soon if it's any kind of large claim at all. Any kind of large claim, the insurance company should be right at the beginning. They want somebody to survey the vessel that's damaged to make sure that, the amount of money claimed is actual valid. And it will really, really help to defend and help the insured's exposures be reduced for that. So I would, if there is a claim, I would encourage your insureds to strictly be really, really, good at getting to the insurance company quickly with anything that's of any kind of size and any kind of ship repair issue. So Mark, next slide, please. Then the next thing I'll point out is the maximum limits of liability. The nice thing about this clause is it gives different limits for different sections of the policies. There's a limit that is for the watercraft damage, any equipment, cargo, and any interest on board. So And then it has any one occurrence, that's covered. And then the legal expenses, it gives another limit too. So you could actually, in certain cases, ask for different limits for different items. And so you may have $1 million in your watercraft damage, and then let's say another $1 million in your legal expenses. And the only thing that you have to watch out for is the last line. The last line is the one that can kind of, catch people. And it says the maximum aggregate for any one claim and all of the above shall be blank. So if you have $1 million in all three of those things up above and $1 million in the aggregate, you're just going to get $1 million between all three of those different coverages. But if you manage to get the underwriter to agree to have more of a limit down there, then you might get, different limits for different exposures in those things, and it might help an insured to really get, the claims settled before it hurts them. And so that's a good thing. But you can ask for it, and companies may give it to you, and sometimes they don't give it to you. So it's just a matter of how it works. And typically in an MGL, if you have an MGL policy, along with the ship repairs legal or any other kind of care, custody, control coverage, you're gonna get the limit of the MGL down in this thing too, just so that it goes into the excess limits, on a different policy. So typically, though, I see $1 million on almost all of these coverages, and then a max is sometimes $1 million, sometimes it can be $2 million. So anyway, next slide, Mark. So one of the things to watch out for, and these are very common exclusions in the care, custody, control policy. The one is death and personal injury. Again, if you have an MGL this is endorsed onto it, this only applies to the coverage for the CCC exposures, for the ship repairs, legal, or whatever coverage you have underneath this. The MGL would not be affected. But in here, there just isn't any coverage for personal injury. It's really just a coverage for things for property damage that are covered. And so this is an exclusion that is in almost every policy where there's just a separate, legal liability for vessel repairs and stuff. Any liability assumed under contract or otherwise an extension of liability which have been imposed upon the insured by law in the absence of a contract. What that's saying is, if you have an insured who's gone into a contract and said, hey, Mr. Vessel owner, I'll repair your vessel, and if I damage it, I'll give you $5 million. Well, that's not necessarily what the law says or what is, required in the standard, court cases. So he's just saying, the insured agrees to something that's outside of the normal course of business, and he's saying that he's going to have a penalty for doing something that is not necessarily a liability. That's a contractual liability and something they've agreed to that's beyond normal. And that would be excluded by most of the policies in the care, custody, liabilities, and especially in ship repairs. That's just not covered. And some I've seen contracts where people who are working on vessels do something like that, where they agree to cover a penalty, and it just is not covered by the ship repairs legal. So be aware of that, and when you get a customer, make sure that they're aware of it too, because a lot of people don't understand that, and they're trying to get a contract in from somebody who they really, really want, and they agree to something like silly like that. Then the next one is loss, damage, or expense arising from any work from the vessel which carried flammable or combustible liquids in bulk as a fuel or cargo on any vessel, which has carried flammable compressed gas in bulk, unless such work is done in accordance with the requirements of the rules and regulations of the NFPA applicable to such work. This kind of makes sense. This says that, if you have somebody who goes in there with a torch on a tanker and doesn't make sure that the tanker has been cleared of any flammable liquids or flammable gases, then they're going to have an explosion. And that was a really, really stupid thing to do, and probably something that's actually against the law. So it's saying we're not going to cover that. if you're dealing with a tanker or with something that is, got flammable compressed gas, you have to make sure that all those places are very clean and very, with no flammable things that you are going to make a problem where you're going to have an explosion or a really big fire come aboard. That's very common, and actually a lot of the laws in most of the states also require this to be done. So it's something that's very, very common, and the exclusion is there in almost all policies that I've seen. The next exclusion is demurrage, loss of time, loss of freight, loss of charter, or similar or substitute expenses. This is saying that, we will cover the stuff that is physical loss or damage. But if just because you have something that goes wrong and the ship stays then in the dock for a longer time, we're not going to end up covering it. We're going to, not pay for loss of time and loss of freight that the vessel has had. A lot of vessels make a lot of money in a very short period of time, and if something happens and they go into a shipyard, they're going to lose those, the freight revenue and things like that. This policy does not cover that. Sometimes you get policies that will do this, but they're a lot more expensive, and there are, separate sub-limits that do this. This is a very normal thing, though, in most policies that are the care, custody, control, ship repairs, legal liability. The next exclusion is loss, damage, or expense, which may be recoverable under any other insurance inuring to the benefit of the insured, or any excess over and above the amount of recoverable herein. That's just saying, hey, if there's other coverage out there, there's duplicate coverage. The insured has two policies that cover these things. He has, a different policy that may or may not, cover these things. That they're saying that this policy is going to be secondary. We're going to be over and above and excess, and if the policy doesn't end up covering it that we thought did, we will step in and pay for it. But we're going to be the secondary policy of any losses. So if you had two, ship repair or legal liability policies, they probably both have this in it, and they'll be fighting over who's going to take over. But what ends up happening is they typically end up settling, and both companies end up putting in stuff. But this is a clause that you will see in most policies saying, hey, we're not going to be, if there's duplicate coverage, we're going to be secondary. So that just ends up happening almost all the time. Next page, Mark, please. So the next page is all other exclusions that you'll find. This first one makes very good sense. I mean, damage to owned or leased items. The ship repair is legal is for when the owner, the shipyard or repair yard or repairer is working on something else. This is saying, hey, Mr. Repairer, if you damage your own drill, or you damage some of the equipment that you have, we're not going to pay for that equipment because that's not what we're doing. Your equipment should have regular insurance on it, and you should have coverage. You're not necessarily legally liable to your own stuff. You damage your own equipment, you should have coverage for it. You lease an item, you should have coverage for that lease item. You know that you have an exposure, and you should go out and buy coverage for it. Very common exclusion almost on all ship repairers' legal liabilities, and it's something that should be there because people should go out and buy their own, property damage coverage. Then you have the expense of redoing work improperly performed by or on behalf of the insured, or the cost of replacement of materials, parts, or equipment furnished in connection with. This is saying if the insured does the work wrong and something happens, this is not necessarily going to be covered because that's not necessarily a care, custody, control. That was work that was done wrong. And if they hire someone who does it wrong, well, they also, that was not a good idea, and it's actually, legal liability for the insured. but it's probably more properly covered underneath the GL or the CGL policy, or the MGL policy, if they have an MGL. The things is that you do something wrong, it's not necessarily that it was, an accident that happened. It was something that you just probably didn't do right. Doesn't mean that, the things that, if you are let's say, welding something and it catches fire, that's not excluded. That's still covered. This is just stuff that the work was improperly done. You put a wrong, put a wrong size of something in there, so it caused damage. That's more of a coverage underneath the MGL. And then you have the cost or expense of repairing, replacing, and renewing any faulty design or part which cause loss of or damage to watercraft, or any expenditures incurred by the reasons of a betterment or alteration in design. This again is more of a general liability, marine general liability type coverage. This is something where they replaced a part and it caused damage to the vessel or to the boat. This is, that is something that can happen. You put the wrong thing in and it damages the vessel. Well, that then, like I said, is covered elsewhere, not necessarily because it was in your care, custody, control. You did something wrong. It's more of a products liability loss. Then any loss or damage to watercraft occurring while in the care, custody, controlled, covered under the above, but not discovered within 60 days of delivery of the watercraft to the owner or charterer, or within 60 days after the work is completed, whichever first occurs. So this is giving the vessel owner 60 days to find out, did the insured make something wrong to cause damage to his vessel while it was in their care, custody, control. Let's say, for instance, somebody, a welder, welded something wrong and left a hole in something, and they then sealed up it so no one really knew it. This gives time for people to discover that that happened, and to go back to the shipyard or the or the repair person and say, hey, you caused damage to my vessel. I didn't realize it when I got it, but I realized it, a month later. I found out about it. I saw the damage. I discovered it. This is saying that, even if the owner of the item takes it and starts to use it, if the insured did something wrong for while they had it, it gives that owner of the vessel a time period to discover that something was done wrong. But after the 60 days is up, then the answer is there's no coverage underneath this policy, because it's really not anything that's in the care, custody, control. It's probably more of a products liability coverage. But this is a good thing to have. It's very broad coverage. And then the last exclusion is war, strikes, riots, civil commotion, and nuclear exclusions. I have seen, policies where people will, put this back in coverage, not necessarily the nuclear, but more the strikes, riots. I've seen strikes, riots coverage be on it, but in most policies, that's an exclusion in the policy. And then if it is covered anyplace else, it's less of a coverage, less broadly done. Very common exclusion almost in all marine policies that I've seen, these three items. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, then this is something that is also an exclusion that I will point out. That's very much in there. Loss or damage to watercraft placed in the care, custody, control for the purposes of storage, regardless of whether any work is also to be performed on the watercraft. Provided this exclusion shall not apply to the physical loss or damage to the watercraft resulting directly from repairs or alteration to it, carried out during the storage period. What this is saying is, you have a lot of, let's say, laid up vessels, especially now with this pandemic going over. There's lots of insureds that, have said, I lost my workload because, no one wants to move stuff anymore. I can't move cargo because, of this pandemic. So they lay up the vessel in a yard, and the yard says, fine, I'll take it. Well, that's not ship repairs legal. That's a wharfinger's legal or a shipyard, it's more of a storage exposure. The ship repairs legal liability is for when work is being done on the vessel, or it's, very shortly after the work is done or right before. There are times sometimes when, the watercraft is there for a day, a couple of days before the work is done, and that would be covered. This is if, it's just sitting there for storage. But, let's face it too, right now, if there's a pandemic going and the tug is laid on up and, the owner of the company says, oh, wow, I really need, something to be done. I could use it. That the policy would still cover that time while it's in storage. That would be the ship repairs legal would still cover it. So do the next slide. Yes, now, Mark, please. So ship repairs, when do you use it? Anytime a work is done on vessel, somebody's painting it, is that really repair? Well, yeah, it is. And, a paint job can really cause damage to a vessel. Let's say the painter is painting down in the engine room and they drop a gallon of paint into, the vessel's motor. That's going to cause a lot of damage. So this is things, that could cause damage. Anytime anybody's doing any kind of repair to a vessel or to a boat, you want ship repairs legal liability. A marine artisan, it could be a small, company that does little tiny work. Even little things like remaking, a bedroom in a vessel, putting in new mattresses. Anything that you're doing in a vessel where you're making it better, working in a canvas, you're putting up new cruise ships, you're putting up paintings in the cruise ship. You want them to have ship repairs legal, so that way if they happen to do any damage while they're there, no matter how small the damage is, that this policy will come in and cover the loss and help the insured to get out of trouble. Little crazy things I've seen where it's very small losses, and but the ship owners say that it caused a big piece of damage. You want a company that knows how to handle these things to get involved, even get lawyers involved and sit in there and really fight for the client. They don't want to have losses to their name. A lot of times things will be very, very small and a big loss happens. So that is, anytime you have anybody doing any kind of repair to a vessel, you really do want ship repairers legal liability to be involved in the policy. You have a GL, let's say it's mainly a land-based guy who happens to do some small work on vessels occasionally, get a ship repairers policy for them. It's not just for people who are big into the business and do a lot of repair work. So next slide, Mark, please.
And I'm actually going to stop you there. We have reached the time limit for this one. I wanted to get to the questions, and we will cover wharfingers with the rest of the liabilities, legal liabilities, next week, or in 2 weeks' time, sorry. But
well, I'm sorry to be so noisy then and so so into the work.
Yep. That is the unfortunate thing about being knowledgeable, is trying to cut you down in 20 minutes is occasionally difficult. But we did have one question. Would there be any rigger's liability included in a ship repairs legal liability?
Well, if they were doing repairs to the rigging, yes. The answer is anytime you're doing any kind of work on a vessel, it doesn't matter what kind of work you're doing, it covers it. So you're doing a rigger's liability and you're on the vessel and all of a sudden you damage the crane or something like that. That's covered then. That would be repair. You'd be repairing something.
That was the only question we had thus far. So I look forward to seeing all of you guys in 2 weeks for the continuation of this series. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much, Ken, for presenting. And we will see all of you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.